The laughter started the moment Carl Jensen walked into Midland Implement in Story City, Iowa, on a cold Tuesday morning in March of 1979. The dealership was the biggest John Deere operation in Story County, right on Highway 69, impossible to miss with its huge green and yellow sign and the row of shiny new tractors parked out front like soldiers on parade. Carl was 52 years old, had been farming since he came back from Korea in 1953. He was there to buy a tractor, had exactly $3,200 cash in his jacket pocket, counted out that morning from the metal box he kept in his bedroom closet. He wanted to look at used equipment, something reliable that would last another 10 years, something he could pay for outright and never think about again. The sales floor had 3 salesmen working that Tuesday. Rick Morrison, age 48, the senior man who'd been selling John Deere equipment since 1961. Dave Patterson, 39, aggressive and smooth, the top salesman for the past 2 years running, and Brad Stevens, 24, fresh out of Iowa State with a business degree, hired 6 months ago during the boom. They were all leaning against a brand new John Deere 44440 when Carl walked in, talking about their commissions from February. Business was phenomenal in early 1979. Grain prices were high, corn over $3 a bushel, soybeans pushing $7. Land values were climbing 10% a year. Farmers were buying equipment like it was going out of style, financing everything, convinced prices would keep rising forever. Rick Morrison alone had sold 8 tractors in February, his best month ever. He'd made $11,400 in commissions in 1 month, more than many farmers grossed in a year. Dave Patterson had sold 6. Even young Brad Stevens, still learning the ropes, had sold 3. Carl approached Rick, the senior salesman. He had his cap in his hands, work boots still muddy from morning chores. "Morning, looking for a used tractor. Something in the $3,000 range. Wondering what you might have." Rick straightened up, sized Carl up in about 2 seconds. 50s, worn Carhartt jacket with a rip in the sleeve, faded jeans, muddy Red Wing boots that had seen better days. Small farmer, probably. Maybe 160, 200 acres. Not a serious buyer. "Used equipment," Rick said, his enthusiasm visibly dropping. "We don't really deal much in used anymore. Market's too hot for new right now. Everyone's buying new because prices are so good they can afford the payments. But I think we've got a 72 40-20 out back we took on trade last month. Probably get 6,500 for it." "Need something cheaper than that," Carl said. "Got $3,200 cash, looking for something solid that'll last." Dave Patterson heard that and smirked. He'd been half listening to the conversation, and the number $3,200 caught his attention. $3,000 for a tractor. What are you going to buy, a lawnmower? Brad Stevens, the young salesman, thought that was hilarious. He actually laughed out loud, a sharp bark of a laugh that carried across the showroom. A couple other customers browsing implements looked over to see what was funny. Rick wasn't quite as openly rude as Dave, but his tone shifted from professional to dismissive. "Look, friend, I don't know what you're farming or how many acres you're working, but you can't compete in 1979 with $3,000 equipment. You just can't. The guys who are making it out there, the successful operations, they're running new 4440s, 4640s, big iron, modern equipment, financed, sure, everybody finances, but that's how you stay competitive in the current market." "I'm not looking to compete," Carl said quietly, his voice steady. "Just looking to farm my land. Got 280 acres. Need a tractor that works?" "Well, you won't be farming long with antique equipment," Dave said. He'd moved closer now, clearly enjoying this interaction. There was a mean streak in Dave, always had been. He liked putting people down, especially farmers he considered behind the times. "This is 1979, not 1959. Maybe you didn't get the memo, but farming has changed. You need modern equipment to survive. Wake up." Rick added, "Dave's right, honestly. I mean, I understand you're trying to be frugal, but there's frugal and there's penny-wise, pound foolish. Buying old worn-out equipment is just going to cost you more in repairs and downtime. Better to finance something new, get the tax write-offs, have something reliable. Carl looked at the three salesmen standing there in their nice slacks and pressed shirts, ties loosened, coffee cups from the pot in the break room. They all had that same expression, mild contempt mixed with pity. They thought he was a fool, a dinosaur, a farmer who didn't understand that the world had changed. He didn't argue with them, didn't try to explain his philosophy, just said, "You got anything in my price range or not?" "There's a salvage dealer in Ames might have something," Brad said, still grinning like this was all very amusing. "Old Farmalls, old Oliver stuff, tractors like that, ancient equipment, might find something that still runs, barely." Dave laughed again. "Yeah, try Pete Hendricks' place. He's got all the junk nobody else wants, perfect for your budget." More laughter from Brad. Rick didn't laugh, but he didn't stop them either. Just gave a little shake of his head like Carl was a lost cause. Carl turned and walked out without another word. As he pushed through the glass doors into the cold March morning, he heard them behind him, heard Dave's voice loud enough to carry, "Some people just don't get it. Trying to farm in 1979 with $3,000. Might as well use a team of horses. These old-timers, they're going to get run over by progress." More laughter. The sound followed Carl to his truck. Carl sat in his 1971 Ford F-150 for a minute, hands on the wheel, staring at the dealership. Part of him was angry. Part of him was embarrassed. But mostly he was certain. Certain that he was right, and they were wrong. Certain that debt was dangerous, and cash was safety. Certain that pride comes before a fall. He drove to Ames, 30 minutes south, found Pete Hendricks's place on the east edge of town, half-salvage yard, half-used equipment lot. The sign out front said, "Hendricks Farm Equipment, used and rebuilt." It wasn't fancy. Just a small office building, a couple of sheds and maybe 20 pieces of equipment scattered around a dirt lot. Pete Hendricks was 73 years old, had been dealing in used farm equipment since 1952. He'd seen boom times and bust times, had learned through hard experience what lasted and what didn't. "Help you?" Pete asked when Carl walked into the small office. "Looking for a tractor, something in the $3,000 range, reliable." Pete didn't laugh, didn't smirk, just nodded. "Got 3 that run good in that price range. Come on, I'll show you." They walked out to the lot. Pete pointed to a red tractor, weathered but clean. "That Farmall 806 there, 1964 model, so it's 15 years old, but it's solid. Farmer who owned it took good care of it, did all his own maintenance, put a new clutch in it last year. Engine's got 4,800 hours, which is nothing for an 806. Hydraulics work perfect. PTO's good, 3,000 even, cash." Carl walked around the tractor. The paint was faded, showing bare metal in spots. There was surface rust on the hood. The seat was cracked, but the tires were good, the engine bay was clean, and when Pete started it up, it fired immediately and ran smooth. "Take it for a drive," Pete said. Carl drove the 806 around Pete's lot. Through the gears, tested the clutch, the brakes, the steering. Everything felt solid, tight, well-maintained. This was a tractor that had been cared for by someone who knew equipment. "I'll take it," Carl said when he came back. Pulled the envelope from his jacket pocket, counted out 30 $100 bills right there on the hood of Pete's desk. "You made a good buy," Pete said as he was writing up the bill of sale. "Don't let anyone tell you different. A paid-for tractor that runs is worth more than a new one you're making payments on. I've seen a lot of farmers go under because they confused looking successful with being successful." Pete paused, then added, "You go to the John Deere place first." "Yeah, they laughed at me." Pete nodded slowly. "They laugh at everyone who wants to pay cash for used equipment. Been that way for years now. They only want to sell new, only want customers who'll finance. But you know what? I've been doing this since '52. I've seen three big busts. Farmers who buy used and pay cash, they survive. Farmers who buy new and finance heavy, a lot of them don't. Carl drove the 806 home that afternoon, puttering along at 25 mph on Highway 69, passing Midland Implement on his way back to his farm. He wondered if those salesmen saw him driving past on his old Farmall, wondered if they were laughing again. Let them laugh, Carl thought. Time would tell who was right. Carl farmed his 280 acres in Story County through 1979 and into 1980 with that 1964 Farmall 806. The land had been in his family since 1951 when his father bought it for $180 an acre, paying cash accumulated over 8 years of working as a machinist at the Maytag plant in Newton while farming rented ground on the side. His father had paid off the land in 1963, 2 years before he died. Carl had taken over in 1971 when his mother couldn't manage it anymore. 8 years now of farming his own place, 8 years of keeping costs down, maintaining old equipment, staying completely out of debt. His neighbors thought he was behind the times. They had new equipment, big 4440s and 4640s, modern combines, the latest planters. Most of them were financed to the hilt, but they looked successful. They looked like winners, like the future of farming. Carl looked like the past. His 1964 Farmall 806 was old when he bought it in 1979, would be ancient by the time he was done with it. His combine was a 1971 John Deere 4400 he'd bought used in 1976 for $8,900 cash. His planter was from 1973. Nothing on his farm was new. Nothing was financed. Through 1979 and 1980, Carl just kept farming. Corn prices stayed good, over $3 a bushel most of the year. Land values kept climbing. Every farmer in Story County was riding high, expanding operations, buying more ground, upgrading equipment. The banks were eager to lend. The dealerships couldn't keep inventory and stock. Midland Implement in Story City was doing phenomenal business. They'd added 2 more salesmen in 1980 to keep up with demand. Rick Morrison, the senior salesman who'd dismissed Carl, was making $80,000, $90,000 a year in commissions alone. That was doctor money, lawyer money. He bought a new house in Ames, 3,000 square feet, swimming pool. Bought his wife a new Buick. Dave Patterson, the one who'd been openly rude to Carl, bought a Cadillac Eldorado in 1980. Bright red, leather interior, all the options. Cost him $18,000, which was more than most farmers cleared in profit that year. Dave drove it around Story County like he owned the place, which in a way he did. He was financing half the operations in the county through the equipment sales he made. Brad Stevens, the young salesman fresh from Iowa State, got engaged in 1980, bought a house in Ames for $72,000, which seemed expensive, but everyone said real estate only went up. Got married that fall in a big ceremony at the Methodist Church. The dealership gave him a $2,000 bonus as a wedding gift. He was making $45,000 a year at age 25. Life was good. Then 1981 arrived, and everything changed. Interest rates, which had been climbing through 1980, spiked to 5% in June of 1981. The Federal Reserve, trying to kill inflation, had raised rates to levels not seen since the Civil War. For farmers who'd borrowed at variable rates, their payments suddenly doubled or tripled. At the same time, the Carter grain embargo, implemented in 1980 in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, was devastating corn and wheat exports. Prices began falling. Corn dropped from $3.20 to $2.80, then to $2.40. By fall of 1981, it was at $2.10. Land values, which had been climbing relentlessly, suddenly stopped. Then they started falling, not slowly, precipitously. Land that had been worth $2,000 an acre in 1980 was worth $600 in 1981, then $1,200 in 1982. Farmers who'd bought land at the peak, who'd financed equipment purchases assuming prices would stay high, were suddenly underwater. Their debt hadn't changed, but their income had been cut in half. Their land equity was evaporating. The dealerships felt the crisis almost immediately. Farmers stopped buying. Orders for new equipment dried up completely. Farmers who'd put deposits down on tractors called and cancelled, forfeiting their deposits because they couldn't afford to complete the purchase. Some just disappeared, stopped answering phone calls, let the bank or the dealer figure it out. By the end of 1981, Midland Implement sales had fallen 70% from the previous year. They'd sold 42 tractors in 1980. In 1981, they sold 13. The commissions evaporated. Rick Morrison's income dropped from $85,000 to $28,000. Dave Patterson went from $73,000 to $19,000. Brad Stevens made $21,000, barely enough to cover his mortgage. In 1982, it got worse. The dealership laid off 3 mechanics, cut the parts department staff from 5 to 2. They reduced salesman commissions from 15% to 10% to try to preserve cash flow. It didn't matter because there were no sales to commission. Rick Morrison put his house up for sale in June 1982. The market was collapsing. Houses weren't selling. He ended up taking a $40,000 loss just to get out from under the mortgage. Moved his family into a rented house in Nevada, a tiny town north of Ames. His wife was devastated. Their kids had to change schools. Rick's youngest daughter cried every night for a month. Dave Patterson sold the Cadillac in August 1982 for $7,200, less than half what he'd paid. Bought a used Chevy pickup for $3,800. Tried to hold on to his house, but couldn't make the payments on his reduced commission income. Bank foreclosed in December 1982. Dave, his wife, and their 3 kids moved in with his parents in Des Moines. He was 36 years old, living in his childhood bedroom with his wife, while his kids slept on couches. Brad Stevens and his new wife tried to tough it out. Brad took a second job at night, working at the Kmart in Ames stocking shelves. His wife got a job as a secretary. They ate ramen and government cheese. But the mortgage on their house was $720 a month, more than Brad was making some months at the dealership. They missed one payment in early 1983, then another, then a third. Bank started foreclosure proceedings in May. Midland Implement closed its doors on July 15, 1983. Just didn't open one Friday morning. A sign on the door said, "Closed until further notice." Everyone knew what that meant. The dealership was finished, crushed by the same farm crisis that was killing the farmers they'd sold equipment to. The building sat empty. No buyer wanted it. Who wanted a farm implement dealership in the middle of the worst farm crisis since the Depression? The lot where all those shiny new tractors had sat was just weeds and cracked concrete. The showroom windows got soap-painted with "For Lease" signs that yellowed in the sun. Rick Morrison moved to Des Moines, got a job selling insurance at Prudential, hated it. The commissions were terrible compared to what he'd made selling tractors. But it was steady, and in 1983, steady was worth more than potential. Dave Patterson ended up at the Firestone tire plant in Des Moines, working the assembly line. Factory work, shift work, union wages. He made $8.50 an hour, about $17,000 a year. 4 years earlier, he'd been making $73,000 selling John Deere tractors and driving a Cadillac. Now he wore steel-toed boots and came home smelling like rubber and chemicals. Brad Stevens, the young hotshot who'd thought his future was set, ended up at Walmart, assistant manager making $14,000 a year. He and his wife lost their house in foreclosure, moved into a trailer park in Ankeny. The wedding photos from 1980, showing the happy couple and all their hopes, sat in a box in the trailer's tiny closet. Brad couldn't look at them. Carl Jensen, meanwhile, kept farming. The 1964 Farmall 806 kept running. When it needed repairs, and it needed several as the years went on, Carl did them himself, bought parts from salvage yards, from other farmers selling out, from Pete Hendricks in Ames, paid cash for everything. In 1982, the tractor needed a new water pump, new radiator hoses, and the front axle bearings replaced. Total parts cost $287. Carl did all the work himself over a weekend. A neighbor who'd bought a new 4440 in 1980 was paying $1,947 per month in tractor payments alone. In 1984, the 806 needed clutch work and the hydraulic pump rebuilt. Carl ordered parts from an aftermarket supplier, did the work in his shop. Total cost, $612. Still cheaper than 2 months of payments on a new tractor. Carl's total equipment expenses for the entire farm crisis period, 1981-1985, averaged about $100 per year. His neighbors with new equipment were paying $2,000, $3,000 per month in equipment payments, plus the higher costs of repairing newer, more complex machinery. When corn prices fell to $2.10, Carl hurt like everyone else. His income dropped, but he didn't have debt eating him alive. His land was paid for, his equipment was paid for. He could survive $2.10 corn. It wasn't comfortable, but he could survive it. His neighbors couldn't. The ones who'd borrowed heavily, who'd bought at the peak, who'd financed everything assuming prices would stay high, they went under. Carl watched farm after farm get foreclosed. Good farmers, hard workers, people he'd known for decades, they lost everything. By 1985, 40% of the farmers in Story County had either been foreclosed on or had sold out voluntarily to avoid foreclosure. It was the worst agricultural crisis since the Depression. The rural economy collapsed. Implement dealers, seed companies, fertilizer suppliers, all of them went under or consolidated. And through it all, Carl Jensen kept farming with his 1964 Farmall 806, the tractor the John Deere salesman had laughed at in 1979. Carl heard about the dealership closing from a neighbor. Felt bad for the employees, but couldn't muster much sympathy for the salesman who'd laughed at him 4 years earlier. They'd been riding high in 1979, mocking farmers who wouldn't take on debt. Now they were unemployed, victims of the same crisis that killed the farmers they'd sold equipment to. The 806 ran until 1991, when Carl finally decided it was time. The tractor had given him 12 years of service. The engine was starting to burn oil, the transmission was getting sloppy, and while Carl could have rebuilt both, he decided it wasn't worth it. The 806 had earned its retirement. He bought a used John Deere 4230 at an estate sale in Marshall County for $12,000 cash. The tractor was from 1976, 15 years old when Carl bought it, but it had been meticulously maintained by its previous owner. It had 3,200 hours on it, which was nothing. Carl test drove it, liked how it felt, wrote a check on the spot. His neighbors, the ones who'd survived the crisis, were still struggling with debt from equipment they'd bought in the late 70s and early 80s. Some of them were driving tractors worth less than they owed on them, upside down on debt they'd never escape. Carl had spent $1,500 total on tractors over 12 years, $3,200 for the 806 in 1979 and $12,000 for the 4230 in 1991. His neighbors who'd bought new 4440s in 1979 had paid $67,000 for them, financed at 8 to 12% interest. By 1991, they'd paid maybe $95,000 total with interest, and the tractors were worth $22,000 if they were lucky. In 1995, Carl was at the Farm Bureau office in Nevada paying his property taxes when he ran into Brad Stevens. Carl almost didn't recognize him. Brad was 41 now, but looked 55. Overweight, balding, defeated-looking. He was working as an insurance adjuster, apparently. Had left Walmart a few years back. "Carl Jensen," Brad said, and Carl could hear something in his voice. Embarrassment, maybe. Shame. "Brad, good to see you." They made awkward small talk for a minute. Then Brad said, "I've thought about you a lot over the years, about that day in '79 when you came into the dealership." Carl waited. "We laughed at you," Brad continued. "Dave and I, we laughed right to your face. Rick was more polite, but he was thinking the same thing. We thought you were a fool, trying to buy used equipment for cash when everyone else was buying new on credit. We thought you didn't understand modern farming. Brad's voice got quieter. Turns out we were the fools. We didn't understand anything. We thought the boom would last forever, thought selling equipment on credit was helping farmers succeed. But we were helping them fail. Every tractor we sold, every combine, we were loading farmers with debt they couldn't handle when prices fell. He paused. And then when the crisis hit, we lost everything too. Lost my house. Lost my marriage, actually. We got divorced in '87. Lost my career. I was going to be a successful equipment salesman, make good money, have a good life. Instead, I'm 41 years old, making $32,000 a year, adjusting insurance claims. Brad looked at Carl directly. You were right, and we were wrong. That's what I wanted to say. I've owed you that for 16 years. Carl didn't know what to say. Finally, I appreciate that, Brad. Are you still farming? Still farming. Same 280 acres, same old equipment strategy. Buy used, pay cash, make it last. And the dealership that laughed at you is gone. The salesmen who laughed at you are all doing something else now, but you're still farming. Brad shook his head. There's a lesson in that. After Brad left, Carl sat in his truck in the Farm Bureau parking lot for a while, thinking about that conversation. About the laughter in the dealership in 1979, about where everyone ended up. Carl retired in 2003 at age 76. He'd farmed for 50 years, starting with rented ground in 1953, buying his father's place in 1971, farming it for 32 years after that. He sold his 280 acres to a neighbor for $2,800 per acre. Total sale, $784,000. He'd started with nothing, farmed his entire life with used equipment, never had an equipment payment, never had a land payment, never owed a bank anything. And he was retiring with nearly $800,000 in cash, plus Social Security, plus the savings he'd accumulated over decades. The salesman who'd laughed at him in 1979 had made big money for a few years, then lost it all when the boom collapsed. Carl had made modest money for 50 years and kept all of it because he had no debt to service. Carl lived comfortably in retirement, bought a small house in Story City, traveled with his wife to places they'd never had time to visit while farming. He died peacefully in his sleep in May of 2018 at age 92. His daughter Linda was cleaning out his desk a few weeks after the funeral when she found a yellowed newspaper clipping in one of the drawers. It was from the Des Moines Register, dated July 17th, 1983. The headline read, "Farm Crisis Claims Another Victim. Midland Implement Closes After 31 Years." The article detailed the closure of the dealership, mentioned the three salesmen by name, talked about how the farm equipment industry was collapsing under the weight of the agricultural crisis. Someone, presumably her father, had circled the article with a blue pen and written in the margin in his distinctive handwriting, "The laughers went bankrupt. The farmer with the old Farmall is still here. CJ, July 1983. Linda showed the clipping to her brother Tom at the funeral luncheon. Tom read it, smiled sadly. Dad never forgot that day. He told me about it probably 20 times over the years, how those salesmen laughed at him for wanting to buy used equipment for cash, how they thought he was a fool. Did it bother him? Linda asked. Being laughed at? Tom thought about that. I think it bothered him at the time, but later, I think he was proud of it. Proud that he'd been right when everyone else was wrong. Proud that he'd survived when they hadn't. That clipping proves it. He kept it for 35 years. At Carl's funeral, his son-in-law Mike gave part of the eulogy. Mike had married Linda in 1985, had known Carl for 33 years, had heard many stories about the old farmer's philosophy on debt and equipment and risk. Carl wasn't flashy, Mike said to the packed church. He never had the biggest farm or the newest equipment. He drove old trucks, wore old clothes, lived modestly. To outsiders, he probably looked like he wasn't doing well, like he was struggling. Mike paused. But Carl wasn't struggling. He was thriving because he understood something that a lot of people didn't understand. Looking successful and being successful are two very different things. Looking successful meant having new equipment, a big operation, an impressive spread. Being successful meant owning what you had, having no debt, being able to weather bad times. He told the story of Carl going to Midland Implement in 1979, about the salesman laughing at him for wanting to buy used equipment for cash. Told how the dealership went bankrupt 4 years later, how the salesmen lost their jobs and their houses and their careers. Carl never forgot the day those salesmen laughed at him, Mike said. He kept a newspaper clipping about the dealership closing for 35 years. Not out of spite, I don't think, but as a reminder. A reminder that the people who laugh at you for being conservative are usually the ones taking the biggest risks. And when those risks fail, the laughers disappear. But the careful ones, the boring ones, the ones who get mocked for being too cautious, they're still there. He looked out at the crowd. Carl farmed for 50 years, bought used equipment, paid cash for everything, never owed anyone. The John Deere dealers who laughed at him in 1979 were bankrupt by 1983. Carl farmed for 20 more years after that, retired wealthy, died in his own home at 92, surrounded by family. Who was the fool? The laughers or the man they laughed at? After the funeral, some of Carl's old neighbors gathered at the farm. The land had been sold, but the buildings were still there, the old machine shed where Carl had done all his own repairs for 50 years. One of the neighbors, a man named Vernon who'd survived the crisis himself through similar conservatism, said, "I remember 1979. Everyone was buying new equipment. The dealerships were packed. If you weren't modernizing, you were considered behind the times. Carl and I, we were the old fools who didn't get it," he smiled. "Turns out we were the only ones who did get it. We got that debt kills. We got that new equipment doesn't make you money, it costs you money. We got that looking poor, and being poor are different things." Another neighbor, younger, maybe 50, spoke up. "It's happening again. Different scale, bigger numbers, but same pattern. Farmers buying $400,000 combines, $300,000 tractors, all financed. Everyone says you have to or you can't compete. Same thing they said in 1979. "And they're probably wrong again," Vernon said. "Just like they were wrong in 1979. The crisis will come. Could be 5 years, could be 10, but it'll come. Prices will fall, or costs will spike, or interest rates will jump, and all those farmers with big debt loads will be in trouble. And the ones with paid-for equipment, the ones people call old-fashioned or cheap or behind the times, they'll survive." He looked at Carl's old machine shed. Carl understood that. That's why he kept that newspaper clipping, to remind himself that being mocked for being conservative is better than being praised for being reckless. The praise disappears when the crisis hits, but the conservatism keeps you farming. The John Deere dealers laughed when Carl Jensen paid cash for that old Farmall in 1979. They thought he was a fool, a dinosaur, someone who didn't understand modern farming. 4 years later, in 1983, all 3 of those salesmen were unemployed, their dealership bankrupt, their own finances in ruins. They'd made big money during the boom, but lost it all in the bust. They'd sold farmers' equipment on credit, helping load them with debt they couldn't service when times got hard. Carl farmed for 47 more years after that day in 1979. Farmed with used equipment, paid cash for everything, avoided debt like it was poison. He retired in 2003 with $784,000 from his land sale plus substantial savings. He lived comfortably until he died at 92, surrounded by family in the same small Iowa community where he'd spent his entire life. The laughers lost. The careful farmer won. The salesman who'd mocked him for being cheap and backwards ended up broken. Carl ended up wealthy and respected, a quiet example of what happens when you ignore the mockery and stick to your principles. That's the whole story. No complicated theories, no secret strategies, just simple math. Debt multiplies your risk. Cash eliminates it. The people who laughed at Carl for understanding that were the same people who lost everything when the risk came due. The farm crisis of the 1980s taught a lot of lessons, but maybe the most important one was this. When people laugh at you for being too conservative, too careful, too scared of debt, you're probably doing something right. Because the ones laughing are usually the ones who'll be gone when the crisis hits. Carl Jensen understood that in 1979, kept understanding it for the next 48 years, died understanding it, and left behind a newspaper clipping with a simple message written in blue pen. The laughers went bankrupt. The farmer with the old Farmall is still here.